I'm Steve Cheney, and I am the CEO of the American Security Project. And let me thank you, Andrea, and Alan, and Joel. We've done a number of these presentations across the country. None have been as well organized as it has here, and we're very grateful for it. So again, thank you very, very much. I've got about a half hour's worth of comments. Each of these guys will do a half hour plus, and then if you're not asleep, we'll wake you up. No, I'm kidding. As King Henry VIII told his many wives, I won't keep you very long. But we do have a message, and it's an important one. So let me start by talking a little bit about the American Security Project and how we were started. And Alan alluded to it. Following the 2004 election, Senator Kerry was not too pleased, as you can imagine. And he was really not pleased because if he ever talked about climate change, he got painted as a left-wing liberal tree hugger type of person, and people immediately doubted the science and doubted him. And the sad part about it was when you looked at the science, you knew it was real and it was happening. He said, but he just couldn't get people to look at the facts, and perhaps it was the messenger and the way it was portrayed. So he sat down with Chuck Hagel, a Republican senator, and said, hey, maybe we can put together an organization that has a balance of Republicans and Democrats, but the focus is not going to be political. Let's put some national security experts into the panel who believe that climate change is indeed a threat or creating threats to our country and our national security, and let them put out the message, and maybe the people won't be shooting the messengers. And hopefully these wouldn't be political types either. So they added on 8 members to the board, were 3- and 4-star admirals and generals, very, very distinguished people, and I still have several that sit on the board. Many had been combatant commanders, General Tony Zinni, Central Command, Admiral Fox Fallon, Central Command, but 2, and Dan Chrisman, Superintendent at West Point, who were very active and very passionate about the subject of climate change, and maybe they could talk about it. Now, climate change was not the only subject that we covered. We are a niche organization, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We don't take any government money. We're not indebted to any political party. But that said, we cover climate change and energy security, and you'll know the overlap, and it'll come up in conversation today. You can't really talk about climate change without talking about energy security simultaneously, because CO2 is what's principally responsible for our climate change, and our energy production is producing the CO2. So you'll hear a lot more about that here in a minute. Then we also talk nuclear security, terrorism, asymmetric operations, and American competitiveness, but the issue today is going to be climate change and its impact on our national security, which we feel, of course, it is impacting our national security, and the military perspective on it is that in every disaster, the military gets called upon to respond, whether it's Hurricane Sandy, Typhoon Haiyan, Katrina, one of the first responders, if not the major responder, and ends up being the United States military. So they end up being the ones who have to plan for the response to these major disasters. And so they've got organizations embedded in them that do strategic planning, and they do it rather well. And all the planners have talked about climate change and written it into their strategic plans. What I'm going to do is turn it over to Andrew Holland. Andrew will indeed talk the science part of it. When he gets done, we're going to pull it back to me. I will mention specific examples of where we feel climate change has created instability or problems in the world that we had to react to. I'll cover the Pacific and South Asia. Then I'll turn it over to General Anderson. He'll discuss the Middle East and Africa. And then we'll wrap it up with a talk about Homeland Security, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Moyer. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Steve, and I'm going to do my talk from over here. So I've got some slides I'm going to run through for you. First, I would say, I wish I could say I'm a scientist, but I'm not. I am an economist by training, but I guess by profession I'm a political legislative aide. I had, previous to coming to work for think tanks, I had worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Chuck Hagel, doing his legislative work. So I'm not a scientist, but I've been around this issue and working in this area of climate change and national security for 7, 8 years now. Long enough, I think, to be able to talk about this. Steve talked some about ASP and our long work on this, and you know, we've done a series of reports which you can all find on our website. www.nationalsecurityandclimatechange.org is our one specific for this. We have www.americansecurityproject.org. We have a Facebook site. We have a Twitter, NatSecClimate. That's me, the Andy Holland on Twitter. So please engage with us, follow us. We want this to be an ongoing discussion and an ongoing thing. This is the purpose of our tour around the country is not to go and, impart our wisdom from Washington on the rest of the country. It's to engage in a dialogue, engage in a conversation, talk about national security, talk about climate change, and then hear from you all and hear from the rest of the country on what is going on and what's happening on this. We're doing this program over these 2 years, 2014 and 2015, and we're really getting all around the country from sea to shining sea. As Steve said, this is our board. As you can see, quite a distinguished group with many, many years of distinguished experience in national security. These are serious people. But my duty tonight is to talk about the science of climate change. And then our generals are going to link that science of climate change to national security. So, starting with the science of climate change has to start with the guys you see up on there. Joseph Fourier, John Tyndall, and Svante Arrhenius. These guys put together the basis for how carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases keep the Earth warm. The question was why doesn't the heat from the sun just all dissipate at night? And they started to put this together throughout the 19th century. So the basic science of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, you could say, is cutting edge 19th century science. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of science being done, and very important science and very important open questions about climate change. How do you determine how much more greenhouse gases will result in how much more temperature rise? How certain areas will react, certain tipping points, all this sort of stuff. But the basic science is true and has been built upon for the last 2 centuries. But let's not talk about theories, let's talk about facts. Well, that is a fact, but let's talk about what's actually happened, what we're seeing. So in the 20th century, air temperatures increased by 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and as you'll see, most of that since the 1970s. The warmest decade on record was the 2000s, with each of the previous decades being warmer than the one before. And you can see, without the year-to-year variability, when you break it into 10-year segments, you can see a pretty clear trend there. So then people always say, but hasn't the climate always changed? And the answer is yes, of course, the climate has always changed. The Earth has never been, one specific stable climate for its, 3.5 billion year existence. It's been constantly changing. And as you can see here on this graph, you can see this is over the last 450,000 years. CO2 has changed, global temperatures have changed, sea levels have changed. We've gone through ice ages, warm periods, the whole range of this. And humans or some sort of pre-human beings have been around for all of this time. But the key part of this, and the key part for national security, is that there weren't that many of them. There were probably somewhere around 4 to 5 million humans, mostly in Africa for most of this time. So, I think they had brains as big as we did, but I think that they spent most of their time just trying to deal with a constantly changing climate. The last 8,000 years, we've seen remarkable stability. And what has happened in those last 8,000 years? Agriculture, human settlement, arts, literature, states, empires, science, everything you see around you has been built upon a remarkable stability in the climate. We've built our cities because of how the climate is laid out. It's not to say that today's climate is the perfect one. It's different all over the world. But all of our infrastructure, all of our built experience, all of our societies is built around this climate that we've been used to, that we've grown up around, and we've built our whole societies around. So the problem is that stability is ending. And as you can see here, over the last 2,000 years, slow downward trend and then a noted spike upwards in the last few years, last several decades, starting roughly a century ago. So why is that happening? If you look at the models, the temperature should be declining. And I'll let Liz talk more about this if she'd like. But if you look at the models, the temperature should be declining. We should be going steadily towards the next ice age. It would take us another 10, 20, 30,000 years or so. We'd have some time built into that. But, with human effects, we see that the models were predicting it would go upwards, and it has gone upwards. That's not to say the models are perfect, and it's not to say that the models have predicted everything. They haven't. There's lots of things that are out there, but the general trends are true and have fit. So, why is the temperature increasing? As I said, carbon dioxide. Here's a general idea of how it works. The sun heats the earth. More carbon dioxide acts as a new blanket on the earth. So it puts a little bit more, keeps a little bit more heat in, keeps a little bit more heat from going into space. And the results of this is a clear upward trend. Now, and it's important to look at this here, because with everything I've told you, the facts are there. Those are facts that and they really, in the scientific community, they are not in dispute. The arguments you hear about it are political, and that's important. Politics is important. We are engaged in politics all the time, every day. But the existence of a problem shouldn't be political. How to get to a solution is definitely a political choice. But the existence of the problem isn't it. So you see, you can always find a downward trend if you look on this graph, but clear statistics shows an upward trend. And people will say, yes, has the climate been flat since 1998? Well, look at that. You tell me. Yeah, maybe. But also, there's a longer trend in there, and there's a lot of heat that's going into the oceans. It's going into all sorts of places, and this is what I was saying. There are certain unknowns in the climate science. So, increasing concentrations of CO2, as I said, clearly correlating with upward trends in temperature. But the effects are clear. So this is what's happening in the Arctic, and this has been one of the clearest trends. You can see from 1979 to 2013, the amazing downward trend, and especially in the end there from 2007 until 2012, and then a push back upwards this year. But it's a clear long-term trend in Arctic ice, and the incredible thing about this is that it wasn't predicted. We are decades ahead of where it was predicted. You can see on the picture there, this was what ice looked like at the maximum in March of 1988 versus March of 2013. And you see a clear difference in, this is multi-year sea ice. So the ice, and maybe you can't see it as well on this projection, but the ice goes all the way around and goes out into the Bering Strait. But the multi-year ice is the real thick stuff that sticks around for a long time, and that's really going away. It's incredible and kind of unbelievable. So how have the models done? One of the most outspoken people on this is Dr. James Hansen, who put out a report in a paper in 1981. Looking at observations and giving predictions. And we've been around this long enough now, 34 years later, we can actually put the trends, the actual observations over what he predicted. You know, and everybody calls Jim Hansen an alarmist. His predictions were more conservative than actual facts. So all of this is to say it is political, not scientific argument that you'll hear. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to General Cheney, who's going to link this in with all the rest, with national security.
Andrew, thanks. One of the interesting things about this is that the military gets it. And if you could throw up the next one, Andrew. They put out a document every 4 years called the Quadrennial Defense Review. And in there it addresses where they think the military has to plan for in the next 4 years. And the current document was put out this February, and there is a significant section in there that addresses climate change. Now, we like to attribute a part of that to now Secretary Hagel, who came from our board. I can tell you he feels passionately about this issue, and he is, by the way, a Republican. But the Department of Defense gets it, and we can talk a lot about what the Department of Defense is doing in regards to climate change. Some may not know the #1 consumer of fossil fuels in this country is the Department of Defense. And they understand that. They're trying to get off of that if they can, and they have a number of issues that I can also talk about that they're doing to mitigate some of that. But they get that. Now, you would say, are we the only ones in the world that kind of understand this? And we're not. The American Security Project did a survey of all the countries in the world who had military establishments, and did they have climate change written into their national security strategy? An interesting statistic, 70% of them had climate change written into their national security strategy as a threat. And you can see from this particular slide, prominent among them, of course, Russia, China, for instance, all believe that climate change is a threat to their countries as well. So why do the military guys even care? And we care because we're the ones who are tasked to respond and plan and budget for responses to climate change and disasters. And there are new hotspots in the world popping up all over the place, and I'm going to address a couple of those. We tend to call it an accelerant of instability, or in our vernacular, a threat multiplier. Let me talk about the Pacific here for just a second, and we're going to, the slide up there shows on the left Typhoon Haiyan, which I'm sure you're familiar with, perhaps the strongest typhoon ever. Sustained winds over 150 miles per hour, hit the Philippines, Maclaban. I had spent considerable time in the Philippines and in Okinawa. I've been through many typhoons. These people are not strangers to typhoons. They understand it, but they didn't understand this one, and they weren't prepared for it. We did a session 2 weeks ago with Brian Norcross from the Weather Channel, who is probably the preeminent hurricane specialist in the country. Brian went there 2 days after it hit. He said the devastation was unfathomable. It was just astounding. It just flattened the entire city. Well, who responded to that? The United States military did. 13,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines went there and provided the humanitarian assistance that the Philippine government couldn't provide for itself. And we kind of did that out of the goodness of the heart. Obviously, they're an ally and a good ally. But an ancillary benefit of that, I believe, was President Obama signing a defense pact with the Philippines last week. Now, we didn't go help the people in Maclaban expecting to get a defense pact, but nonetheless, I think the Philippine people appreciated it. But we were the ones, we are perhaps the only ones, the United States military, who can respond with that number of people in that amount of time, and I know the rest of the world really appreciates that. What you see up there on the left side is a picture of Bangladesh. And I belong to a group called the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, which is a couple of senior military officers retired from every country in the world, and we've tried to get every country in the world. Two of them happen to be from Bangladesh. One of them is a major general named Muni Razaman. And Bangladesh has a huge problem. They have 5.5 million people that live on the coastline that when the water level goes up 1.5 feet, they're going to be without a home. And they know it. And sadly, the way that things are going now, we know the water will at least go up 1.5 feet in the next 20 to 30 years. So they're going to be faced with 5.5 million refugees, and they've got to go somewhere. I doubt they're going to go to India. There's not a good relationship between those two countries, and there is a very armed border between the two. I doubt they're going to go to Myanmar either. Bangladesh, the military guys understand that. The government knows there's a problem, but if you follow the political situation in Bangladesh, they're a little more focused on stability in the government right now than they are the refugees they're going to have in 20 or 30 years. But General Muni Razaman, is banging that drum hard to say you've got to do something for it. Now, the United States has what we call the Pacific Command. It's a combatant commander. The world is divided up into geographic commands from the armed military's perspective. The Pacific Command commander is a Navy 4-star named Admiral Locklear, and he has mentioned on multiple occasions that he views the #1 threat in his AOR to be climate change. And he, of course, is looking way down line, but he knows the instability that's caused by things like droughts, major disasters, typhoons, water rising, is going to cause him to have to deploy his forces, and he has to plan on that. Next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Steve Anderson. Steve's expertise is Middle East. He's had considerable time in Iraq and lately a lot of time in North Africa. So Steve, with that, I'll let you talk about those two, and then I'll pull it back to talk about our homeland.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. First of all, there's something I got to get off my chest. On behalf of the Washington Wizards, I'd like to apologize for the thrashing that we gave to the Chicago Bulls last night. I'm terribly sorry, and I'm sure you'll return the favor when the Cubs come to town on the 4th of July at Nats Park. But it's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see so many people here. You guys care, and that's why you're here, and that means a lot to us, because we know that when people care, the right things happen. So thank you so much. As Steve said, I'm a kind of a Middle East guy. I spent most of the last 10 years over there. I was General Petraeus' senior logistics officer for 15 months in Iraq. And I'm a small businessman now, owner of a service-disabled veteran-owned small business based in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we do a lot of work in Afghanistan, Oman, Kuwait, Iraq, and believe it or not, we have an office in Benghazi, Libya. And you're probably not going to hear that from a lot of people. So I do have some experience over there. And the Middle East is an amazing place, but I think it's a great place to look at it as kind of a representative of what the world's coming to when it comes to climate change. And if you look at what's going on in Iraq, first of all, you can look at energy expenditure and how it's directly related to climate change, and I believe because energy and the way we consume energy, the production of CO2 drives the climate change that we're seeing, and in the Middle East have terrible water problems as a result of that. But as the logistics officer in Iraq, I got to see firsthand also the credible toll that this nation has paid because of our dependence on oil. Because the only way that we can sustain troops overseas is to use carbon-based fuels. Ladies and gentlemen, over 1,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have died moving fuel in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is something that most people aren't familiar with. But it's true, well over 1,000. And that's because they constitute a large majority of the vehicle traffic and convoys. And at the peak time in 2007, I was bringing 1,000 trucks a day from Kuwait to sustain our troops overseas, or in Iraq. And of that, about 700 or so, 650 to 700 were doing nothing but bringing fuel and water. And of course, every time that you have folks on the road moving fuel, providing escorts and medevac and engineering services and route clearance and whatever, there's a lot of overhead involved, then you're putting people at risk. And if you can get those trucks off the road, you can reduce the risks. So it's incredibly costly in terms of blood, but it's also incredibly costly in terms of us as U.S. taxpayers. If you consider the fully burdened cost of fuel, delivering fuel to places like Afghanistan, it's over $50 a gallon, considering all the overhead. And you do the math, over $15 billion a year, that's with a B, billion, is being spent delivering fuel or on fuel and energy consumption in Afghanistan. So think about it. Think of it if we can reduce that somehow, 10, 20, 30%. We're talking billions of dollars of cost savings. And think of what we could do with that money instead. So it's so important to understand, like I said, what, the generating end of it, and then what's the resultant end. And that is, you'll see in the Middle East, climate change is driving water issues and the scarcity thereof. And specifically, I wanted to talk about Syria, and hopefully we got that up there. If you look at what's going on in Syria, a lot of what's happened as a result of the climate change that has made the area much less farmable, shall we say, because of lack of water. And it has driven 1.5 million people out from the farmlands into the cities. And of course, that has played directly into Assad's hands. And he's been able to use that. And not only has it created people and created turmoil and turbulence, but it has created a climate in which Islamic extremists can make their message and drive those points home and recruit people, to, of course, do some of the things that they've done. So there's a terrible issue going on, and I believe that it might not directly be related to climate change, but certainly peripherally, and certainly it's a contributing factor that has helped push the situation in Syria. The other one I mentioned is sub-Saharan Africa and Mali in particular. And if you understand what's gone on over there, again, water scarcity in the south has changed the way that the nomadic people, the Tuaregs, earn a living. And they have been unable to sustain how they've traditionally had lived and farmed, and they had to move north as a result. And what that created was obviously a lot of tension because the people in the north didn't want them up there. And that created a lot of the instability that happens. So there are other examples like that. You can talk about Egypt and whatnot, but what it gets down to is that climate change is creating the instability that Steve and Andrew mentioned earlier, and that instability is making it more and more likely that soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from our country may have to deploy to keep the peace. I'm not saying it's going to happen all the time, but if it's a compelling national interest, it will be. And that we'll be there the first. So we care about climate change because we have to pay the price, that being the military. So to me, it all comes down to risk management. We know it's a problem. We can argue about how extreme the problem is. But even if you are a climate change denier, you should at least acknowledge that it's smart to buy an insurance policy, that we need to at least take some actions. We need to do what we can to mitigate the risk. And that's what the military does. We don't assume these wars are going to happen, but we plan for them in case they do. And when you plan for things, you can have a much better shot at actually succeeding in whatever you're trying to achieve. And that's what we need to do. We need to, in this country, acknowledge that climate change is real. Climate change is a problem. We've got to enable policies that will do something about it, develop renewable energy technologies. Think about the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. If they were able to use renewable energies instead of carbon-based energies, how many more soldiers would have come home as a result of that? So I ask you to think about that and think about our need to mitigate the risks associated with climate change. And with that, I'll turn it back to Steve to talk about Homeland Security.
Yep, Steve, thanks. And I am going to bring it home here a little bit. Oftentimes I get approached by people who say, not in my backyard. If it didn't happen to me, then I'm not really concerned about it. But interestingly, more and more Americans are starting to heed the message. Just today, coming in, was turned on CNN, 2 major military bases are underwater. Naval Air Station Pensacola and Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Both of them shut down for the first time that anybody can remember because of a historic flood there from 23 inches of rain yesterday. I usually use Eglin as an example of one that's going to go underwater anyway, because the sea rise is going to come up and flood them. Another one is Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. We know that one's going to go underwater as well. Hampton Roads understands that, and they're trying to make a plan to see what they can do about moving that installation. But you can go across the country, whether it was Katrina or Sandy or the forest fires or the floods, we're being impacted by this dramatically, and you're being impacted here as well. You're not scot-free. The Great Lakes are in jeopardy. Their water level is starting to go down. And I heard an amazing statistic this morning that 5% of the CO2 that's pumped into the world's atmosphere comes from the 6 Midwestern states from burning coal. That's a staggering statistic, in my opinion. So oftentimes we get asked, well, okay, what are we going to do about this? We've got to limit our CO2 emissions. I mean, that's the simple answer, but it's never that easy, of course, and there are a gazillion ways to do that, and we can address a lot of that in the question and answer period. So with that, I'm going to pull back, and I think, Liz, do you want to make some comments?
Yeah, I was actually inspired by Andrew's, I was just going to answer questions, but I was inspired by Andrew's talk to say, well, I have a few things I'd love to say in response to that. And one of the first things is that I'm very impressed by the effort that these guys, as a scientist, by the effort that these guys have done. So Andrew says he's not a scientist, but the only thing that I saw wrong in his slides was when he put up the 3 guys, and which I was very happy to see that slide, and said these are 19th century scientists, because Fourier was actually an 18th century scientist. So it's even older for speculation. I mean, Fourier, if anybody does physics, Fourier invented the Fourier transform in mathematical application because he was trying to understand the surface temperature of the Earth, why it is what it is. I mean, he was interested in these questions, 200 years ago. Those were of import to people. So again, going back to the roots of climate change, I want to tell you a little bit about what those guys did, which gives us some context for thinking about what climate scientists do now. So Arrhenius, who was the guy on the far right, more than 100 years ago, made the first estimate of the temperature change of the Earth if you double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, he didn't think we could do this because at the time, the economy was so small, there wasn't many people, the industry was small. He said, well, if you could hypothetically do this, this was what it would be, but it would never happen, You can't possibly, he did the calculation on an envelope, based on the current rate of emissions. He said that would just never, we can't even humanly imagine that happening because he didn't imagine that the economies would grow exponentially, since his time. So he got that part wrong, but he was very close on his estimate. His first estimate was a doubling temperature of about 6 degrees Celsius. And then he sort of said, well, I'd better back that off. And his second estimate sort of took it down to more in the 3 degrees Celsius range. So if you looked at the latest IPCC report, which is a compilation of, many works by many climate scientists based on enormous numerical simulations running at supercomputers, some of them at Argonne. I see some of the Argonne climate scientists in the audience here. And the latest IPCC report says, well, we have now an estimate for doubling temperature. It's somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. So it kind of brackets this guess from 150 years ago. So what does that tell you? It tells you that in 150 years, we haven't been able to disprove climate change. It's very, very fundamental physics that if you add an infrared absorber to the atmosphere, you warm the surface temperature. That's completely normal. The other way you can see this, if anybody wants more context, is we can think about water vapor, which is another infrared absorber. And you all know the difference between, hopefully many of you have traveled, between being outside at night in Arizona, where it's hot in the day, and at night it cools down, and outside at night in Louisiana, where it's damp at night. And so it's 80 degrees during the day in Louisiana, you're not going to be in a down jacket at night, right? That's what a greenhouse gas does. So you can't feel the difference in CO2 because CO2 is pretty evenly distributed around the Earth, but you can feel the difference in water, and that gives you context for thinking of what addition of CO2 is. Addition of CO2 is like making the world more like Louisiana than like Arizona. That's what we're thinking about. But 150 years of progress in giant numerical simulations and lots of computer time, and we still don't have the details. So we know the basics, we know the fundamental physics, we know the scale of it, but we can't, and we can tell you some things we robustly know. We know it will warm more at the poles than at the equator. We know that the northern hemisphere, the northern high latitudes will warm first, which is why we see all the problems in Alaska now. Those are predicted universally across models. We're very confident in those predictions. But exactly what will happen in a given area, what will happen in Chicago, will it rain more, will it rain less? In this particular area, will variability increase or decrease? Those are hard to know. We know that we do know robustly that winters will warm more than summers, which people could say is a good thing or a bad thing in Chicago. But there's lots of the details that we don't know yet. We have lots of scenarios. The big simulations are useful for producing a variety of scenarios of what could happen, but they can't give you something where we can actually tell you what will happen in 20 years to the degree. And we can't tell you in particular that one of the things that's highly uncertain is the amount of rainfall change. So as context for why I'm here, I am a co-director of a center we have at the University of Chicago called the Center for Robust Decision-Making on Climate and Economic Policy, and Climate and Energy Policy. And that center is funded by the National Science Foundation as part of a program they have called Decision Making Under Uncertainty, because they recognize anything to do with climate is necessarily an uncertain decision. And the purpose of the center is to bring together the computer scientists, economists, statisticians, climate scientists, and legal scholars to provide some sort of unified approach to thinking about how do you make a decision about what to do in these uncertain circumstances where we know that we have a risk, we know that something is happening, we're quite certain about certain aspects, but we're uncertain about the details. And we're specifically non-ideological. We're scientists. We're intended to provide neutral advice and scientifically grounded studies. So since we have economists involved in the center, one of the things we are working on is how to make robust economic decisions. The other things we work on are impact studies, where we use model projections, very complicated and detailed projections, to try to understand the possibilities under climate change. And I want to reiterate that despite all these efforts, including impact studies and economics studies, we can't actually tell you right now the economic cost of climate change. I can't give you a number and say it will cost this much. It's something we have never had a whole branch of economics that's been focused on this issue because, as Andrew told you, we haven't really had to deal with the changing climate before. So this is new. It's something that people are trying to wrap their heads around. They can look at individual sectors and see potential problems that might arise. As a physical scientist, we look back in the fossil record and we say, well, the last time this happened, lots of species went extinct, which is kind of bad. So, it makes me a little nervous. I look in the past at analogs in history and I'm like, well, that time it went up by 8 degrees and 90% of all the marine species died. That doesn't sound good. In that particular episode, lots of volcanoes went off. They think, it's not certain, but they think the volcanoes went off underneath a giant coal seam deposit. So basically you have something very similar to what's happening now. I mean, that was the mother of all problems all at once. But, we look at those things and we say this is a very large change in the history of the Earth. But there's still a big gap between that, noticing that something is a real risk and a real problem and a geologically significant event, and having a detailed forecast of exactly what will happen in a decade. And that is why we appreciate the military's interest so much, because the military is one of the few organizations that is willing to be grimly pessimistic and confront decisions made that are not pleasant and that are really uncertain, but that you have to do anyway. So I wanted to conclude by saying, I've given several public talks in Chicago, and in one of them a couple years ago, I decided to start by saying, the world is divided into two kinds of people. And the first kind of person thinks that climate change is a terrible problem, but all we have to do is put some solar panels on our roof and hold hands and we'll just solve it. It won't be a problem. We just have to have the willpower and it will be easy. And the other kind of person thinks that climate change is a terrible hoax that we have to expose, because if we actually did all the things these other guys are recommending, we'd bankrupt the economy. And basically those two viewpoints are either we have to do it, but it's easy, or it would be horribly hard to deal with it, but we don't have to do it. So it's easy. It's a good decision either way. Those are optimistic perspectives. And the actual answer is we probably have to do something about climate change, and it will be really hard, and we have to make those decisions under uncertainty. And that's a very difficult position for people to wrap their heads around. And so, we as scientists are happy to support the efforts that the security people are doing on this issue, because they are willing to confront these very difficult decisions that are very important, that can involve big costs and big expenses, and things that matter to a lot of people, and yet they're not easy things to do.
Andrea, it's all yours.
Well, actually, thank you, Liz, because you kind of summed up and brought around some of the questions that were asked repeatedly today. So thank you for doing that. One of the questions that a lot of people asked in several of the groups we had was, what is the military doing? Because they do have the resources to move forward some of the solutions for climate change that perhaps the private sector does not have the resources to address. So if one of the generals or Andrew can take that question, what are some of the things the military is currently doing?
Well, the answer is the military is doing a lot, but probably not enough. They certainly could do more, but if you look at, military being one of the largest single consumer of energy as an entity, probably in the world, certainly the United States. There's all the services have taken climate change very seriously and are trying to do things to enable renewable energy technologies. And they're doing it not so much because climate change and because they're a bunch of tree huggers or anything, but because they're interested in energy security. They want to be able to sustain their base in an uncertain world in which the electrical grid could get shut down. Or we can't get the fuel and the energy the old way, and so they're looking at that. And so I'm proud to say that DoD has sponsored some of the biggest solar projects in the United States, and is doing lots of really good things. Soldiers care about it because we know we're going to have to pay the price ultimately when we get it wrong. Now, but I will tell you that there's more that we can do, but it's so critical to use and to leverage the military in this country because if you look at two of the great assets that this nation has is the incredible university system that we have, in which we are part of tonight. It's the rival. No one can touch it in the world. I mean, it's the envy of the world. Our university system and our military. Same kind of situation. Regardless of whether you're a hawk or a dove, the military is an incredibly professional organization that makes a lot of good things happen. And we've been very successful, and so we can leverage the military to drive the kind of things that we need to do to develop renewables or alternatives to what we're doing now. And you just go through history the last 100 years, every single significant piece of technology, starting with the steel revolution, through, putting a man on the moon and developing rockets to do that, to developing semiconductors, to GPS technology that you use in your phone right now, to the internet, to telecommunications, to satellites. All of it got a major, at least a major shot in the arm from the military. So we can leverage the DoD capability to really, I think, start attacking this problem. And it's comforting to see that a lot of people in DoD get it and are trying to take steps in that direction. Steve, you want to add to that?
Well, and I'll take it from another tack. And it's from the strategic planning perspective that the recognition that climate change is a threat. So you've got the combatant commanders who have to sit there and have to look far into the future and say, where do I have to tailor my forces to combat threats that are posed by climate change? And they've got significant organizations that are looking way down the road, 10, 20, 30 years at perhaps migration patterns, wars between countries that we're probably going to be involved in. They're pretty good at planning those things, and it's interesting that it's not the Department of Energy, and I think this country lacks an energy policy. We need an energy policy here, a comprehensive one. We don't have one, but the Department of Defense is the one that's kind of spearheading the lead on energy consumption and what to be done about that, as well as strategic planning.
And another question that came up repeatedly today. Can this really be a nonpartisan issue? And I know your group works on that extensively at ASP, but can you address that?
Andrew.
I'll start because I do come out of Republican politics, and I've come at this issue based around facts. And I actually started when I first got assigned to do climate and energy policy. I said, oh, climate change, isn't that just that left wing Al Gore? It was when Al Gore was coming out with a inconvenient truth. But then what I did is actually sat down and I read the IPCC report, with the previous one. So we've just got the most recent IPCC report came out, is coming out right now. The last one came out in 2006 and 2007. And I sat down and I read it. I read the summary for policymakers first, and then I started getting into the more detailed report. And I think that reading the science is sobering, because there's no way that this many people and this many smart people working on this for so long And the IPCC, they're not, I don't think they're paid, right? So this isn't like some sort of conspiracy out there. If it is, it's the best kept secret in the world, and for the worst reasons. It's not a conspiracy, and it's an impressive body of scholarship out there. So I take it from the facts, and I think based on the politics, the facts will eventually win. Eventually, a party that denies the facts, a party that doesn't, pushes it down for the long term, won't do well in the long term. So, you can, like Liz said, it's a hard problem. It's a fiendish problem. There's multiple levels and multiple layers of things. If the United States acts and the rest of the world doesn't, well then, it still doesn't mean anything. So there's so many things that are so difficult about this. So it's easy to just throw your hands up and say, oh, well, we won't have to deal with it. But, you do have to deal with it. And I like the military approach, and I think it's the right one. General Anderson talked about it. It's risk management. It's take a look at the risk, plan for what is coming down the road, mitigate, so reduce emissions for the long term to prevent the worst effects, and then really rigorously monitor what's going on, because there are certain tipping points and certain, we call them speed bumps down the road, that we don't know what they are and we don't know where they're coming. But if we can at least detect them a little bit beforehand, maybe we can do something about it. Stuff like methane releases in the Arctic, or the transition in tropical forests, or stuff like that, that could be really dangerous.
I want to make a real comment real quick. I'm a conservative Republican. Many people are shocked to hear that. The only conservative Republican that believes in climate change, maybe in the world. It's sad. There's a few of us out there, but it's like, where's Waldo and where is that guy? And I'm that guy. But and I got it. Like Andrew, and just looking at the science and realizing that 98% of the climatologists in the world believe that there's a serious problem and a man-made climate change is at hand here, and there's only 2% that don't. And it's like the Tom Friedman analogy that, hey, if your child was sick and you went to see 100 doctors and 98 told you to do this procedure with your child, well, we all know what we would do. And the 2 of them said not to do it, well, you'd go with the 98. But when he started looking at the sciences, the quote scientists that were climate change deniers, a lot of them look really similar to the same guys that were working for the tobacco industry back in the 50s and 60s. And it's true, there's some of them are the same guys. Professional contrarians, and and making a living doing this stuff, and it just disgusted me, and I realized that the Republicans are on totally the wrong side on this issue, and so I decided to join the fight with ASP and hopefully convince some of my brethren to jump in. The water's fine.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, from my perspective, climate change pushes a lot of psychological buttons, and it makes it a very difficult issue to talk about. Anything that's a big problem that involves some kind of solution, it's not going to solve itself. So you have to do some kind of program to change the playing field for energy technology, which is by definition a government program. Hopefully you can do it. I mean, we all live in Illinois. We know the opportunities, what happens when you have big government programs involving big flows of money. Hopefully we could do that efficiently, but there is a justifiable fear of big government, and people who are afraid of that will psychologically say, well, it must not be necessary. And equally, it gets caught up on the side. I teach these young environmental kids, and sometimes, there's a very knee-jerk reaction that they want something, they want a utopian world where everyone has a little solar panel in their backyard, and the issue gets wrapped up in all these kinds of psychological issues and desires for what the world should be like. And the problem is, it's a technically complicated issue. It's much easier just to listen to somebody or something you read on the internet, and then there becomes this echo chamber of the people talking about stuff they read on the internet and saying things that aren't really grounded in science. And so by now, the climate in the U.S. it's really complicated and difficult for making progress. on something that is a difficult, but at root, it's a technical engineering and security issue. And I'm hoping that we can try to make the issue less volatile and less emotional and more kind of boring and practical, like scary, but just let's get back to this level of like, okay, in these scenarios, what would we really do?
And just one more quick thing before we open up for questions. Liz, if you just want to take a moment to address Midwest, obviously we're a lot luckier than if we're in Louisiana, but climate change and Chicago region, Midwest region, what can we expect?
So people ask me that question a lot because it's so much more interesting to think about local effects. What would happen in my backyard? Will the tornadoes get more? Will they get less? And I'm trying to develop a standard answer, but the best one I have so far is that, in a world with climate change, if people ask me where I would move, I would probably say move to the Midwest. Because of all places, we have a lot of open land, we have a very low population density, big food production, one of the breadbaskets of the world. We're not on the fringes of it, we're smack in the middle of the Corn Belt, so if the Corn Belt shifts north, it's going to be a while before it shifts past Chicago. We have technologically very advanced farming in the US, people who are able to respond. We're right next to an enormous body of freshwater. We're not subject to sea level rise in Chicago. We're not subject to hurricanes. So locally, yes, we'll have, if a mean temperature will certainly go up, which means the summers will be hotter, and those times when it's miserable in the summer, there will be more of them, and the misery will be more miserable, and that has health effects, right? So that's a very clear consequence. But for the Midwest, it's not why we're worried about climate change. So I asked a colleague, I said, I'm coming to the downtown Chicago to talk about the risks of climate change, and he's somebody who works directly on impacts. I said, what are you most worried about? Tell me what your biggest concern is. He said, look at this paper we just put out. He said, this band here, and he showed me, is a band that stretches from Iran, Pakistan, India, and China. And he said, in this entire region, agriculture is completely unsustainably irrigated. All these countries are dependent. Half of the world, third of the world lives in those places. Several of those countries have nuclear weapons. They are irrigating so fast that they will run out on a timescale of decades. Now adding climate change to that mix. What happens when people in Iran are hungry? That's what you worry about in the Midwest, not that you're going to have flooding in your basement. You worry about those kind of situations.
Exactly.
And on that very happy note, I will open it up to questions for our panel. Yes, sir.
I was hoping you could help me understand. It's kind of a complex question. It's basically probing. Andrew, you opened it up. And let me get the whole three parts out. Sure. It goes from the left to the right. Everybody's ignored methane. And methane is always been associated with global warming. That's part of it, and it goes to the University of Chicago. With the water rising, we have all these underwater vents in the Arctic and Antarctic. But if you do mass balance, it's coming from below, not above. So you have to understand that. And the third part that goes to the military is if we have climate change occurring, and we have solar flares, which are going to be ionic in nature, they're going to disrupt our whole satellite system. So how do you see climate change and solar flares interacting and protecting our satellites and communications network? And that's, I think, part of us.
Maybe I'll start. I don't ignore methane. I think it's for a general audience. It's easier to just talk about carbon dioxide. But methane is an extraordinarily important greenhouse gas as well, and I think one of the key tipping points that we need to be watching and looking at is methane releases in the Arctic. There's a huge amount of methane trapped on the Arctic seafloor, and a huge amount in permafrost. And if that and when that starts to melt and get released into the atmosphere, this idea of it's a methane bomb, and you could have very quick and very nonlinear problems. And we have to be looking at that, and we have to be dealing with that. And that also goes into your third point on satellites. We need to have continued investment and continued sustained investment into satellite observation of all this. We can have that, and we do have that, but I think there's some talk, and I'm not that familiar with it, but of satellites being running out, and we're not replacing them fast enough on this, monitoring satellites.
Gentlemen, fourth, yes, you. Green shirt.
Obviously, we have in Washington a big budget issue. I'd like some feedback as to whether or not climate change should be under the budget of the Defense Department or Department of Energy. And, you know, I ask that in a way that maybe it's more palatable if DOD manages this than Department of Energy politically.
The answer is all the above. Certainly, and I took a swipe at the Department of Energy earlier, or the administration not having a comprehensive energy policy, and that's where it's got to start. And it ought to cross all the cabinets. Obviously, I'm a little parochial in regards to Hagel and Kerry, but I happen to know them both very well, and I know they feel passionately about the issue. So you've got two of the major cabinet secretaries, and Hagel, of course, with the QDR came out in February, and then last month, Kerry stood up in Indonesia and gave a significant climate speech. Now, the State Department, I don't believe, should be the one responsible for climate policy in the country, but he certainly has beaten that drum pretty hard. There are some huge financial problems. We just went through sequestration. The Defense Department recognizes it's got to draw down. So there's a balance here. We at ASP have been talking greatly about the investment that the country makes in science and technology, that we ought not be cutting back that investment to places like our laboratories. Argonne's a prime one, for example, that you need to make these investments to can do that. You can't be so nearsighted to cut that off and not invest in the technologies that we feel are ultimately part of the answer to this problem, i.e. like fusion, for instance, in a long-term basis. So it's not any specific department. I think the administration has got to shoulder the load. Then you've got to convince people on the Hill to fund it. It's not an easy problem. But that said, I think we're starting to get a little more traction on this kind of stuff. People are starting to listen. If you can get beyond the politics of it and look at the specifics, maybe we can make up some ground.
Just one quick follow-up. Within 5 years or so, we're grid parity with solar. You know, that's the estimate. But
You say that again?
5 years. Grid parity.
Yeah.
Yes, economic.
Okay.
But it typically takes 50 years to make a transition from one energy source to the other. Should we be incentivizing not our renewables and disincentivizing fossil fuels as policies to speed up this transition?
Who wants it?
I'll take it.
Okay, Liz, have at it.
Okay, so I would say whether solar reaches grid parity is not certain. That is something that people want to happen. It might happen. It's not clear. You see a real drop in panel production costs right now, but the dominant cost of solar is the guy who installs it, and that labor cost is not. It has a floor right now. So it would take probably a technological breakthrough for solar to be cost competitive. That might happen. It might not. In terms of how could we accelerate it, I just want to say we have a pretty good, robust capitalist system in this country where people like to make money, and there's actually an advantage to that. Is if something is cost competitive, they usually run about doing it. So if solar becomes cost competitive with other sources, yeah, we have a lag time because the infrastructure is long lived, but we wouldn't need an energy policy, right? Because that we would just make the transition naturally. So why do you need an energy policy? You need an energy policy when there's something you're doing that has a cost to society that's not incorporated in the price that you see. I will tell you the story of the only other conservative Republican I know who believes in climate change. He's a wonderful guy, a former congressman from South Carolina, I think, North Carolina, Bob Inglis, great guy. And his job now, he's going around part of an institute and he's advocating for what we call revenue neutral carbon tax. He says, okay, the problem is just that we haven't priced these incentives correctly, that yes, renewable and carbon-free energy costs more, and that's just the way it is right now. We got to deal with that. If it didn't cost more, we wouldn't be in this situation, right? Right now, we're just doing the thing that's actually easiest, and it has some externality that's not incorporated in the cost. So we have to just change the pricing landscape, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't impose a net penalty on the American people other than the fact that our energy will cost a little more. So you have to make some sort of system that puts a price on CO2 emissions and returns that money to taxpayers in some other way. Right? So that's the only way you're going to minimize the cost of making the transition. But that's a very different perspective from saying climate change goes in a particular agency that is mandated and given a budget to deal with it. So it's a totally different kind of solution. And I would say that's the solution that most climate scientists would go behind because they know how big the problem is.
Yeah, I would just add that it needs to be a national priority, not an agency priority. That's the issue. And if it's a national priority, it needs to be part of an energy plan, and all the agencies need to be integrated, and we can leverage the agencies like DOD to do things that can help stimulate the things that we were just talking about here, to drive R&D and to drive an economic model that makes sense to incentivize, the businessmen and women, small business owners like myself, to go out there and do great things, and be able to compete.
Okay, let's see if we get some other questions here. Okay, sir?
Maybe I don't understand you correctly, but I thought you said that it was the U.S. military, by and large, that came to the support of the Filipinos during the typhoon incident.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that when future climate change-related problems occur, it will again be largely the U.S. military that has to respond.
That's correct, too.
So my question is, why is that? What about other militaries? What about other resources?
Yeah, I
did mention other countries very much.
I mean, I deal a lot with other countries. If you've been following defense budgets worldwide, and I'm sure many of you have, the defense budgets in other countries are going down much more dramatically than ours. And NATO is a prime example, for instance, and we've been pushing back to NATO saying, now you're seeing a threat, i.e. Russia, and would you not use this as an instigator to raise your defense budget and shoulder a little bit more of the defense burden of NATO, of which we shoulder the majority of it. But the fact of the matter is we are, by magnitudes, the largest military establishment in the world. And even with sequestration and reduction in the budget, we are the only ones who could move 13,000 troops to go help the Philippines. Nobody else can even come remotely close to it. We've got a phenomenal Air Force that can move things. Well, Steve can address the logistics. He had all the logistics in Iraq. We're the only ones who have a seaborne force that can move Marines on amphibious shipping. Nobody else has the capability. They just do, and they won't invest in it. They're not interested in it. We have viewed this as a national security priority, and we put the money up front, and we're the ones who are doing it.
Yeah, we talked about Mali, and it was the French who went into Mali and have actually succeeded in quite a good counterinsurgency campaign there, but they had to get there on American planes. So even a strong military like the French military still relies on the American lift capability.
You betcha.
But let me just point out, we don't necessarily have to go to every single issue. I think it's kind of part of your question. We'll go where the president and where the nation tells us to go. Okay. The issue is, though, the climate change is going to create many more opportunities for us to have to deploy places like that. I'm just saying if there's a climate change event in Iran, I don't think we're going. Okay, I don't think that we're going to. Yeah, well, we can argue about that, but I don't believe that a humanitarian thing. Yeah, maybe different situation, earthquake or something like that. I know, but I'm saying, there's a lot of instances probably when it wouldn't be appropriate to us. But the fact of the matter is, we're the only ones that can. And in many instances, and there's going to be many more opportunities for us to have to potentially deploy because the climate changes that are happening before our eyes.
I'm trying to get to as many questions as I can. Sir, in the middle, in the gray shirt, yes.
So food security was mentioned a little bit in terms of the U.S. being the breadbasket, and there was water security in terms of increased droughts. but does the American Security Project address impending food security issues that have to do with the ocean biosphere? Because there's the existing strain on overfishing, but there's the climate change direction that has to do with ocean acidification and potential impact on kind of foundational biosphere like phytoplankton. Now, is that a big part of your guys'
It's, you know, it's a huge underlying driver that I've actually got a slide that I didn't use today is showing how the ocean is acidifying and how rapidly it's happening. And it's one of the really scary and unknown things, like how fast is this going to happen and what are the effects going to be. It's something that hasn't happened in 8 million years, I think, was the last time there was an event like this. So we just don't know how it's going to happen. And, you know, the oceans are the great commons of the world. And the U.S. military is the great protector of the commons of the world. So the Navy protects freedom of the seas. So, you know, clearly there's an interest there, and there's an understanding. I haven't done a study of it. I haven't done a report of it beyond what I just said. So I am interested, and I would like to do more, and I would like to learn more. So, you know, go send us an email if you've got some details, and we'd love to get more involved. It is a threat.
Sir?
Yes,
Art.
I'd love to engage in an ongoing debate on the science of what we're talking, but I'm not going to, because it's become so polarized and politicized. It's a never-ending debate that seems to not reach a definitive workable conclusion. What I'd like to ask instead has to do really with something that's gotten very little visibility and to me is important. No matter which side of the spectrum one believes or supports, the fact is that there are many indications that climate is changing, whether it's man-made or natural. My question is, why are we not, as a matter of policy, focusing on adaptation rather than believing that investing all our resources in reducing fossil fuels is going to solve or mitigate the problem?
You want to start?
Adaptation, it seems to me, on a global scale, is far more significant and of magnitude that will affect billions of people, and that hopefully can help to mitigate the consequences of storms or ocean rising. And by the way, if I misheard you, I'd like...
Should we, let's, I think we got the question. Maybe we should go to an answer.
I'm sorry?
I think we have the question, so I think we're ready to answer now. I want to say that...
I wanted to finish the question.
I know, but I think we have it down. So would you like, could we answer?
I wanted to ask whether I heard somebody say that the ocean is going to rise by 1.5 feet in 20 years. Did I hear that said?
You did.
I believe you're an order of magnitude too high. It's more like 2.5 millimeters a year that the ocean is rising. That's the data. That's the trend.
That's absolutely
Am I correct?
It's specifically right.
What? Well, okay, in Bangladesh. But I think the ocean rising 2 millimeters a year puts it in a time frame where people living along the coast and the threat that involves gives us a different time frame to do something than something as immediate as Bangladesh.
So my answer on adaptation is not that people are ignoring adaptation. It's that, you know, the world has 7 billion individual actors in it who have free will, and they will adapt, right? We all expect that they'll adapt. They don't need, in general, in most cases, a government program to help them adapt. You know, farmers are confronted by changing climate. They plant different crops. You know, there's plenty of agricultural companies that are willing to help them by preparing for the crops of the future, and those companies are already invested in research plans. They don't need policy to help them do that. They have a self-interest in doing that. I think the concern is that in a lot of, and the U.S. has better capability for adapting than much poorer countries. And there's two reasons for that. Is first, we're simply technologically more advanced and we're richer, but also, the agricultural impacts that we fear, the models, the one thing that we can get out of these models, and the ag models are not that great, but they are fairly robustly predicting that yields go down in the tropical countries where people are poorest. So we don't particularly, I think at this point, need a government program to help people adapt in the United States, but we have to be prepared for the adaptations people are going to take in those warmer, poorer countries. And the biggest adaptation they do is they pick up and move, right? That's mostly how people adapt to crisis, especially it's how they adapt to being hungry. And I think that's why these guys are involved and are interested, because when very large numbers of people begin to pick up and move the places where they are hoping to get more food, that generally creates political problems, and that's exactly what they're concerned about.
Yeah, and I would add that, like I said, the military looks at this. I would say that the premise that we're not doing adaptation is at least for the military, completely wrong. The military has a detailed climate adaptation plan, and it has asked all of the Navy is engaged in a full adaptation plan for all of its bases, looking at all best available science and then building a risk premium into there. So it's a risk management problem, as I said. When you talk about risk, even if you don't want your house to burn down, you buy fire insurance. It's about